we spend so much time, so much energy focused on, hey, here is like better messaging. Here's how you're putting your value props together. They spend 10 seconds on average reading what you wrote. So like 10 seconds means 40 words. And like the average cold email is 125 to 150. So that means they're not actually reading anything that you write.
This is Sales Hacker, a podcast for modern sales professionals who are looking to create more pipeline and close more deals. In each episode, we explore the latest sales tips, tactics, and strategies from leading industry pros that will teach you how to capture and connect data, streamline workflows, and do mission-critical work smarter so you can create opportunities more efficiently and close deals more predictably.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. If you're new to the show, welcome. If you've been here already, welcome back. Today, we're joined by Will Allred, who is the co-founder and COO of Lavender. This is your third startup, right?
So I've attempted being a founder. I've been a founder, and now I've been a founder with some success. That would be how I would describe it.
I think you're understating it. Lavender is really cool. For people who don't know, it's an AI-powered tool that helps you write better emails faster, I think is the simple way that you put it, which at this point is probably oversimplifying it because it's grown and become something that I think is a little more than that. And for people who don't know, you worked with Sales Hacker. I think you did like over 50 episodes of a video show called One Email, Two Takes. Kicked it off with Christina Finseth, where people would send you emails to tear apart, or you would just get outbound emails and tear them apart, but then offer very constructively two different takes, two different ways to improve it.
Yeah, it's a great series.
It
So
is.
if anyone listening, check out the Sales Hacker YouTube, or literally just go to the videos page on the
Yeah,
Sales.
we'll drop it in the show notes.
Yeah, I had a blast putting that together. And so we're doing our revamp of it now. We were just talking about this before. And like thinking about how do we take it to the next level, I'm very excited. We've got some awesome guests alongside. I'm actually recording an episode later today.
Oh,
with,
sweet.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're doubling down in a big way. You're calling it Pardon the Outbound. Is that right?
Pardon the outbound PTO, man. Yeah, I'm very excited about it. We're going to be cycling in a lot of co-hosts with me. And the idea is similar to One Email, Two Takes, where you'll see the breakdown of that email. You also see the rewrite, multiple takes of that rewrite, but some higher production value, which is always fun, as well as like some really clearly defined like topics for improvement on any of the messages that we see. So you'll see some great emails, you'll see some not so great emails, but you'll also see some familiar faces from your LinkedIn feed offering some perspectives as well on what's driving the message performance and also some different ways to approach it.
Super exciting. And how do people find it?
Yeah. So they'll be able to find it through Sales Hacker's YouTube channel. They'll be able to find it through the Sales Hacker website. And then I also want to say y'all distribute it through your newsletter, which I'm super appreciative of.
Oh, yeah. So if you're not subscribed to Sales Hacker, the newsletter, maybe some of you only know about the podcast. We send out a killer newsletter every week. And we work with awesome people like Will to make sure it's filled with stuff that is not written by marketers, but by people who know what they're talking about and actually do this stuff for a living. So yeah, check it out. In reacquainting myself with the series to get ready to talk to you, I was looking at it just on saleshacker.com. People have spent hundreds of hours watching those. I mean, I think the pages have like
Love that.
15,000 views. So this series is not like a small thing. The fact that you're bringing it back, but like revamped and doubling down on it really gets my juices flowing.
It's amazing how many people have either used it and called outbound to me. Literally,
Oh,
the
sweet.
email I'm tearing down today does that. But on the flip side, yeah, it's like I'll get like random messages from people I like would never imagine having conversations with. But it's cool, right? We saw a gap in the market related to content on a specific topic and like angle towards said topic. When we first started that show, the thought process was like, there's a lot of people tearing down emails, but there's not a lot
Mhm.
of people building them back up. And
Yeah.
so we wanted to showcase, yeah, here's what's wrong with this bad email. Or, yeah, the rare episode where we have a good email. Thank goodness, right? and we could
Mhm.
talk about why it's good, showcase like that, put them on like the limelight or the lavender light, right? And then like showcase some more ways that they can continue to double down on those good things.
Yeah, I really like it because the intent of the show is, it's done with love. It's
Yeah.
not one of those, like, salty LinkedIn posts like, "I'm a
Yes.
sales leader, and I hate when people try to sell to me." You're here
Yeah.
to
I'm a
say
sales leader and I hate when I'm cold called those
right,
people.
right. Yeah. Well, so look, I think you're the perfect guy. I wanna get into, like, prospecting nitty-gritty with you
Let's do
in
it.
a bit, but before we do that, I just wanna hear how things are going at Lavender, because I think you started the show over a year ago. Is it over 2 years? About over a year ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say 50 episodes. So probably about a year.
And
We
so
tried to
that's
do one.
probably about the time we first talked.
Mhm.
And I know Lavender's grown a lot since then. So how are things going? Like, what's your stage of growth? What's your trajectory?
Yeah, man. When we first talked, when we first started the show, we were bootstrapping, yeah, barely staying alive as an organization. Yeah, our brand certainly preceded us in a lot of ways. Over the course of 2022, we had some amazing growth. Really started to see that trajectory um, take place. A lot of the overall efforts we've been working on since 2020 finally started to pay off. And so now we've, yeah, went from bootstrapping to we've raised a Series A. We raised
Hey,
13.2 million Q4. And so now we're building out a lot of like core infrastructure and like scaling upon that. So just doubling down on a lot of the things that worked in the past. Yeah, things like helping people get better and do better with what they do and, just growing overall.
that is amazing. I think I missed the announcement for the Series A. Congrats.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I got plenty of congrats on the funding emails. I can
I bet. Yeah.
I started a whole folder. I literally have like a Google Doc that just like runs. I call it the bad email file, and like 99% of them start with, "Hey, Will, congrats on the funding."
Yeah.
Anyways, dot dot dot.
Yeah.
Like here's
Yeah.
my like pitch for how you should spend that
Yeah.
money.
Anyways, give me some of it. Yeah.
Exactly. As though like we raised it with zero plan on how we're going to spend it.
I mean, you know what? That's not uncommon,
Oh,
but you can always find a way, right? There's a lot of probably pretty obvious ways once you've got the money. You go, oh, this is
no, no, I'm mostly joking that, like, most outreach assumes that, like, we've
oh,
met
I see.
Leon. Yeah. And so, you, like,
Right.
look at these messages and you're like,
Yeah.
"I yeah, okay."
Yeah. You're not part of the plan. You mentioned earlier that you like, I can't remember if this was your phrasing. You attempted to other startups, and you said humbly, this is the first time you're seeing some success. What lessons from those first two attempts, do you find yourself applying to Lavender and thinking back on like, oh, I'm glad I learned that lesson because now I can do this?
Yeah, so my first attempt was, before I met my now co-founder, William Balance, depending on who you ask.
Shout out, Will, if you're
He's
listening, we love you. And we know
absolutely
you are listening, so thanks.
100%. So, I was think of like Gong, but for recruiting calls in a lot of ways. Yeah, I was having a lot of interesting conversations. I'm not a technical founder. And so like there was nothing built. And so I was running into a lot of roadblocks on that front where I got like really far down the line with like Turner Broadcasting. And like they finally were like, cool, like let's run like a quick like proof of concept. I'm like, oh, that it actually doesn't exist, right? I'm just like, I wanna make sure that, like, you wanna buy it, and, like, if you buy it, like, we can build it, and, like, they were like, "We don't buy software that's not built." Lessons learned along the way. But that conversation led to me going to a hackathon where I met Will B. We met actually playing rock, paper, scissors, was the icebreaker for the event, and we ended up working together on a marketing tech project for that weekend that eventually became Sorter, a company that we started together and spent 2 years on. And we had some limited success. We sold to groups like Gravity Blankets, Yamaha,
Oh,
and like the core principle of it, if you're familiar with like the Crystal Nose and the Humantics of the world, we were applying that at scale. So if you're running a Facebook ad campaign or a direct mailer or any of like these larger at scale efforts, we could segment it by those personality types and tell
very cool.
people what they should be doing accordingly, right? So, like introverts prefer cooler blue hues. And, if you're going to use imagery of people within the message, particularly for introverts, like make sure you're only using one person as opposed to a group. Avert their like gaze versus like direct eye contact. The problem with that is like those people aren't measured on how well they targeted introverts versus extroverts. And so like the
Oh, yeah.
sales cycle itself, like we just like never quite nailed it. And start 2020, we were really refining that product into a place where it was effectively lavender, but for marketing. We were running some crazy successful experiment with Facebook ads. So we were able to point out like exactly in the copy what was driving return on ad spend for their ad campaigns. We were like within a week doubling the groups like ROAS, and so ROAS being return on ad spend. And so like we were going to market with this. We had a lot of pipeline related to like automotive in particular. I mentioned
Oh,
like
interesting.
Yamaha. So
Huh.
we had a lot of pipeline in that world, D2C world, and some of our biggest customers were in like the co-working world. And so March of 2020 was a shell shock moment for us where,
Yeah.
co-working paying and like automotive, D2C, like wow, ultimately like the ad space and inventory got really cheap and people started to scale that up. Like there was a real sharp drawback at first. And we had like 45 days of runway and had to come up with something to do. And fortunate that I have the co-founder that I do because he came up with what is now Lavender and was like, the idea at first was like, we'll launch it on Product Hunt and use it as like cash flow to keep business alive. And it turned out to be a little bit more popular idea than what we thought. And so we ended up just like going all in on it.
That is a cool pivot story. Speaking of Product Hunt, I am getting deep into I'm trying to get a handle on the generative AI tech landscape, specifically for sales, not the whole thing. That would
Yeah.
be impossible. But even in sales, it's next to impossible because then something new launches on Product Hunt like every day.
Yeah. The barrier to entry is like minimized now.
Yeah. And what I've noticed in looking at all these tools is that what matters a lot is like what you let the rep do, basically.
Mhm.
Like you have to limit them, not let them run free and just like basically put a pretty skin on ChatGPT. I also did a poll on my LinkedIn for my audience, and I found that about half of my followers in sales used ChatGPT to do their jobs in the last week. I was a little surprised because just it's kind of haphazard. Like it makes me worry, I guess, because so much of it matters, depends on your prompt engineering
Yeah.
and like how you use it. And I know that that's what Lavender does well, is it kind of puts this all into a structure and a framework that actually lets you use the tool intelligently, not just use it to replace your brain.
Yeah. I'm smiling because I think about this in a number of ways because there was a period of time where our users were flustered that we weren't doing more with it.
Mm,
And looking back now, I'm like, wow, we made the right call.
yeah.
And the reason being is because you being a fancy front end on top of GPT is not a competitive differentiator. It's not what's going to win in the long run. I don't think like it's GPT is like Stripe, right? You're not building a business because of Stripe. You're building a business because you offer something of value and it's just a payment infrastructure. And so when you think about GPT, everyone has it now.
Hmm.
So like Outreach, for example, is launching like cadence writing or sequence writing, right? The ability to write a follow-up email. All of these things are becoming very, very easy. And it's like low hanging fruit for these product teams. And so like to me, I'm like, thinking about this and I'm like, the thing that matters is not chat GPT. It'll be very accessible. So you saying like 50%, it'll go up. It'll touch every rep's daily life. The key is the application layer that you interface with ChatGPT and all these things on top of, right? So when we think about what we built, our focus was on building a content intelligence tool that
Hmm.
helps you be more productive. And so what makes Lavender special is not how we use ChatGPT. What makes Lavender special is that we dig in and do the deep dive analysis of what's driving your messaging to work And the reason it's useful is because we take that and we apply it back into your writing. So
Mm,
I'm reaching out to you, Colin, like, and I know that when I'm writing shorter emails, I'm getting more replies. Like, that's helpful information, and then it's delivered real time. Like, that's exactly what you need. Not, hey, write me an email to Colin, and then you send like I've found like just using the chat interface, like if you're really good with prompting, sure, like you can be pretty good with it. But like even still, like the nature of a large language model is effectively to add additional information. And we know that's not good for getting response.
yep.
So like there's a lot of like these interesting like challenges that I think we're gonna see pop up in sales as these things become more pervasive, which is like, is it actually helping save you time? Is it helping you create and craft something that's value to the person on the other end? Like you think about what GPT is, it is the average of everyone who writes on the
Yeah.
internet. So
Yeah.
like if you think about what's a good seller, like
Or said in a less polite way, it's the lowest common denominator.
yeah, it's just like if you're trying to have your team excel, do you want them to be average? Or
Yeah.
do you want them to find what's working for top reps and like be able to replicate that extremely quickly and like use that? So there's like it's very different. So my whole like thinking on this is like it's about the interface, but it's also about like just the application layer. That's where you win in this space.
Yeah. 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 100%. Yeah. I'm seeing the sales world kind of split into two groups. Half of people are like really excited about the shiny object. And it, uh,
Yeah.
to be honest, is very fun to play with. And the other half of people are leaning hard in the other direction and saying, screw this. This is about fundamentally being good at selling. What does your prospect need to hear? What do they want to hear? What do you have to convey to them? And how do you do it in a way that helps them listen to you? So that brings me, let's talk about prospecting.
Yeah.
Your knowledge on this runs deep, 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 deep. And I found myself like the theme of this show is basically things I've always wanted to ask my guests. I have people
I
on
love it.
where like I have a relationship with you, but we haven't sat down and I haven't like gotten to pick your brain on what I know you're a genius at. And so I was listing out my questions and then it struck me that actually some of them have been answered before because you did that Ask Me Anything on the Sales Hacker forum.
Yeah. I want to do more AMA style stuff.
Yeah, that was fun.
I distribute so much content on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn's not a great avenue for an AMA.
It's a great avenue, but yeah, it's ephemeral. I wish there was a better search function there. But anyway, so I ended up actually just going back to the AMA, and what I'm going to do is I'll give shout outs to a few community members that asked the same questions that I wanted to ask. So
Love it.
this first one is from Samantha Hembry, who actually used to be part of the Sales Hacker team. Hey,
Yeah,
Sam.
I've met her.
She's the best. The question was, what is your framework or do you have like a formula for writing a great email?
Yeah. So every great email starts with context and a reason for why you're reaching out. That kind of drives everything else, right? Even if it's a long email versus a short email, like it doesn't really matter the scenario. You're starting with this context of like, yeah, even if it's like mid funnel, right? Like, hey, had a really good call. We talked about the following thing, context. Then the next thing that you'd want to say is, here's exactly what we think is the next step, right? Included some details below versus cold email. I'm sending it and I'm saying, Colin, loving the new podcast. You've brought on some really stellar guests as you're thinking about yada, 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 right? So like the context in that like standpoint is like your podcast and I've watched it. And then like I'm moving that into why I'm reaching out in that scenario. So if I'm thinking about like core framework for like good email in general, that's like bar none have to have it. Now, if I'm saying a good framework for a cold email, that still holds true. And there's like several different ways that you can do this, right? One of the things that I'm seeing right now is some of my earlier frameworks are becoming popularized.
Mm,
Doesn't mean they're executed well, but like people when I post a framework, I'll usually accompany it with a sort of like a templated like version of how it could come to life. I use it as a teaching example, not as like,
Hmm.
here's the final draft that you should go and copy and paste, right?
Yep.
Problem is like you have to get people away from templates.
Yeah.
I I despise templates. And the reason I despise templates is a template is like the easy button. It's
Hmm.
you're not actually teaching the person on the other end anything other than, okay, I can regurgitate this.
Sure.
Meanwhile, framework, if you line it out, it's like, here's what you're trying to accomplish here. Here's what you're trying to accomplish after that. Here's what you're trying to accomplish after that. Right. So, like, if I say, start with an observation, tie that observation back to a challenge that they're probably facing, give credibility to speak to that challenge, and then ask if they're dealing with that challenge. Right. That is instructional, not necessarily, hey, go regurgitate these exact words. Now,
How
you
important is the logical link between the context and the like your ask or what you need
critical,
to say?
critical. It drives me nuts. I refer to this as like the anyways problem. Hey, I saw your yeah, I saw your Braves fan in its opening day. Anyways, right? Like you're just kind of like, okay, why did you waste my time? You're leveraging the like ability to it's a silver bullet, right?
Hmm.
You're leveraging the ability to hack someone's attention for a short period of time. But problem with that tactical approach is eventually the well dries up, right?
Yeah.
Eventually people get savvy. Like my brain has been evolving for millions of years, as like all of ours have, right? To find ways to reserve calories at the end of the day. And so, if we're wasting calories and we feel like we're wasting calories in certain places, we start to create biases. We start to create categorizations within our own brain related to whatever that thing is. So, in the case of spammy emails, right? I hope this finds you well was probably really great way to start a cold email at a point in time because, oh, they must be a friend, right? Only friends say that. And so then you open the email and you start reading it and it's like warm and familiar. And then all of a sudden it's the only thing that starts a cruddy, spammy email. And
Yeah.
so then it becomes like, okay, I'm kind of moving past that.
Becomes a pattern and you start to pattern match. And then all of a sudden, anything that has that is just an instant, unsubscribe or ignore, put in the trash folder.
Exactly. And this is
Yeah.
where templates fail us, right? One, in that logical progression of thought, but two, in this concept of like pattern. So as soon as something becomes pattern, you have to you have to be able to figure out, okay, what am I iterating on? What am I testing? What am I moving around? And people get like really caught up in like the weeds of A/B testing, where they're like, I've never done this before. I guess like I'm supposed to be very scientific about it. I will change this one word and I'll see if it makes a big difference. And in reality, you learn absolutely nothing from
Mm,
running that test. I always tell people like a good test, you like you have A and you have B and you know what C is going to be based off the outcome. Now you might have to adjust C a little bit based off what you're learning, but like you should have like a hypothesis for what's the next step. And that
mhm.
means understanding, okay, either I broke this template down into its underlying little Lego blocks that make it up, right? It's like, oh, I made an observation. Well, did I change the observation? And that's why I got better success? Or like maybe I put the ask next to the observation. And so I say, Colin, loving the new podcast. Mind giving me some feedback on this? And then get into the pitch, right? But like the problem is like people aren't experimenting enough with moving these things around and getting creative with how they're positioning it. And that's where like
Wow.
new trends come from. So, yeah, as we've built the company, one of the key trends that we've seen evolve rapidly is length of email. It's a signal to me that people are following tactics. So when we first started, it really didn't matter how long your message
Mhm.
was. If you wrote a email that took a minute to read, they would still read it, assuming it was personalized. The tolerance for that shifted, and I refer to it as the Kyle Coleman special. Like the 125, like perfect amount of word count was like pinnacle. And then that shifted and the bottom fell out. And it was like either really short was doing well or really long and thoughtful ones are doing really well. And then the bottom fell out on really long and thoughtful ones. And now it's just really short ones. And it's actually like there was a stretch of time where it got even more intense on like really short ones. And now it's like starting to like curve out again, where you're seeing like instead of 25 to 50 words with like a massive fall off at 75, you're seeing 25 and then it kind of plateaus at 75 and then it falls off again. So like you're seeing these things shift rapidly. And the question is just like, what's driving these trends? And it's, yeah, buyers picking up on patterns.
Interesting. And it's probably all cyclical. Like at some point, the really short email and the really long email might come back and both be popular again, right?
Mhm.
And effective.
Yeah. I mean, it
Um,
all depends situationally, but at the same time, yeah, I know I get a long email right now and I don't want to read it.
yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. We had another in that again in that Ask Me Anything. This one's from Joe Latshaw. Is another like longtime friend of Sales Hacker. He's actually one of our founding members. Hey Joe,
Hey,
if you're
Joe.
listening, and we know that you are. He asked the kind of the next step, and sorry to out you, Joe, but at the time he said he had about 18 to 20 steps in his sequence. And so his question to you was like, is that too many? And how do you build a sequence? And this is where we kind of get to just like length of email matters, length of sequence maybe comes in and out of fashion
Yeah.
as a trend. So how do you think about building a good sequence?
I think this also depends on your definition of sequence. So, one of the things that I'm seeing come into style, I will say style, right? I'm seeing a maturity curve across organizations where you've either got like, I'm reaching out to a list, I'm reaching out to a persona, or I'm reaching out to accounts. The next tier is like reaching out to accounts. That's like
Mhm.
really where I'm seeing best of class outbound organizations focus. That means like they're running campaigns focused on like above the line, below the line, different persona below the line, different persona above the line. They're changing how they talk about the product in these different like moments. I've been like doing some TikTok recordings where I've like broken down emails that I've gotten where you can see organizations starting to think about this and they're like failing on the personal, like on the messaging aspect, right?
Mhm.
Like if you're reaching out to me about your technical product, don't talk to me like I'm a CTO. Talk to me about the things that I care about. And so it's like, hey, we have this like API integrator. Like I see you're having a ton of success with outreach customers and like you're not integrated with HubSpot yet. Our product can help you integrate faster, right? Like I'm not thinking about integrate faster. What I'm thinking about is the addressable market that you can open me up to and like tell me about how I can sell into more HubSpot customers. Right? That's like a way more interesting message to someone in my position. And so like showcasing that, trying to teach that, I think is really key. So the sequence itself, I think is fundamentally changing.
Mm.
The duration, I think where like the nuance comes in like the message is like, how long should a sequence be, right? Is that a really long sequence? Well, you're always working the account, right? So technically it's a really, really long sequence. You're just working different individuals across that account. But each like outreach campaign to an individual within said account, that's where it gets different. And it's no longer the 20 touches to like the VP of sales. And then like, okay, I guess that account will come back to that with a new rep later. Right.
Mm.
Instead, it's like 3 to 4 to the VP, 3 to 4 to the director. At the same time, you're running, 2 to 3 to someone below the line and like continuously working that. And then if something new comes in from below the line, you're bringing it to the top of the line and you're like, yeah, depending on what you learn, right? If it's like, oh, we have this one particular process, like that's not like groundbreaking. You might bring that middle, like above the line instead of like top above the line, right? Yeah. If the team is actually way behind quota and like we're completely underreporting on it. Like that's amazing. Like let me bring that up to the top of the line, right? But if it's like something a little bit more nuanced about how they use like a tech process, I might not bring that up to the VP of sales who's going to be like, I don't really care, you know?
Yeah.
So like thinking about the entire account and how you thread it together that's really the future of where the sequence goes. The challenge is like getting people out of the mindset of like, okay, I'm going to set that up in outreach and I'm going to have the VP of sales be in a sequence for 25 steps now, but they're going to be further spaced out. And then,
Mm,
I'm going to also put in, yeah, and like getting people in the mindset of how to adapt and adjust for that, which is going to require some more active, like next step setting where it's
yeah.
not like a step that's a email, more so it's a like check to see if anything's happened below the line and then like come back.
In that world where you're kind of sequencing at the account level, but multi-threading to contacts above the line, below the line in an account, how do you think about then personalizing? Here's what I'm getting at
Yeah.
is like in an ideal world, right? Everybody has the exact right account targets. They can multi-thread into every account. Every message is personalized, but you get to this point where that's just not maybe realistic. Like it's a time investment that can't be made by many sales development teams. And so I guess I wonder like how do you think about the trade-offs there on volume and
Yeah, that's the first thing that anyone will say to me. And I will tell everyone that scale is made up of individual accounts. It starts with like a startup mentality, right? Where like you talk to a founder and they're like, I have to close all of these companies by like the end of the year. And then you start to like pare it down. You're like, these are really like the best fit. And I need to like go get them closed. I have the best chance of getting them closed. And then like you start to like do the math on it. It's like, okay, it all breaks down to the micro. We just get so focused on the macro. I was talking with the team the other day and I'm like, okay, hey, Ease, what's your meetings booked per month quota? Like 4. Why are you sending 400 emails then? If your meetings book quota is 4 and like, yeah, they need to be hyper qualified and sales accepted and all this stuff, like you start to like do the math on it. And this idea of scale really does start to melt away. Now, I'm not saying like volume needs to go by the wayside. I'm just saying like when you think about how you put together that activity, it's themed around a reason for reaching out, which can continue to build as you learn what's going on within the organization, right? So I think the days of like, I do outbound to my ICP and they respond, and then they respond leads to meeting, leads to XYZ is getting very stale. And it's because they're not the only one involved in that deal. And so how you actually think about breaking in, it needs to be more complicated. You need to think about all the conversations you're having across the org. And it's like, it's just inherently going to change.
do you know Tito Bort?
Yeah, I know Tito.
You sound like him, man. Like you guys are both so thoughtful and data driven and just unwilling to accept like dogmatic approaches to
It's
go to
for
market. Like you
yeah.
like if someone came to you, I'm imagining and said, hey, Will, I know this is your first startup ever. This is you like years ago. Here's how you go to market. I imagine you being like, I'll see for myself. And like getting down in the weeds and figuring out every little step and questioning every assumption. I love it. I
I,
wish more people did it.
I'll tell you what, man. Being, I was actually joking internally because we've been having this like internal conversation around like how we run discovery. Is it like through demo? Is it like in a jump to like long story short, we've been getting into this like back and forth. I had this realization, like, I don't know if I've ever actually seen good discovery. And yeah, it comes back to, I think we've just always been too poor to see good discovery. The reps that do it well are selling bigger deals, right? But like, there's a similar like mode within prospecting, which is like, I came to it from the lens of like, okay, I'm seeing how people are outbounding to me. Like, I know how it makes me feel, which means it's making someone else feel that way. And then I'm looking at the data across millions of emails and I'm like, okay, like what I'm seeing is supported by what the data says. What if we just like started to apply that? And then you start to see people see valid results, right? Like our average reply rate across our user base is 20.5% for a cold email, like
Wow.
touch. And
Wow.
because they're taking a thoughtful approach. And so like this idea, like back to this idea of scale starts to melt away is like, if you get a response to 1 in 5 emails, well, you don't need to send as many emails, right? If you approach somebody hyper focused with a very clear point of view on why you think you can help their business, well, it doesn't become a, okay, Colin, like what I pitched you on with our product is kind of interesting to you. Now we have to have a discovery call so that like I can actually figure out how you are translating all of the things that we offer back into your problems. Instead, I'm showing up having done my homework. I've got a point of view on how we're going to help you. And like you're adding layers to what research I've already done. I've included discovery in the prospecting prospect in the process. And like that's like the like deal cycle itself should inevitably shrink and shorten.
That insight that being a buyer and seeing how people sell to you can inform your own go to market motion is something that I have said myself. The instant I had a director title, this is years ago at a marketing agency, the instant I had a director title, I was like, oh, that's how I should have been doing this. Or I'm seeing what I did wrong because people started marketing to me and trying to sell to me. Turns out I didn't have a budget. So their efforts were wasted, but there's something to that. And actually I wrote this down to talk to you about. Graham Gilovitz, shout out, another awesome Sales Hacker member, posted an idea not too long ago in the forum on Sales Hacker where he said he oversees a business development team and he averaged it out. He gets about 12 cold emails a day. He forwards all of them to his team so that they can see and discuss in email threads
Yep.
what other sellers are doing well and doing poorly. And I was like, that's brilliant because most sellers don't know what it's like to be sold to. And once you look in that mirror, it can really inform your approach. So this is a long way of asking you, how do you onboard sellers at Lavender and like get them to understand, what
Yeah.
that sales motion, how it's being perceived?
We have like training slides and literally the first set of slides are here's how your buyer goes to their inbox. Like literally that is the number one thing that I focused on in training is shifting that perspective that they have because we spend so much time, so much energy focused on, hey, here is like better messaging. Here's how you're putting your value props together. Like we'll get into the weeds on like instead of saying we help XYZ and we're like, you know what? Let's switch that. Let's say XYZ is accomplishing blank because of what we do. And I'm like, the buyer doesn't give a shit. They spend 10 seconds on average reading what you wrote. So like 10 seconds means 40 words. And like the average cold email is 125 to 150. So that means they're not actually reading anything that you write. They are categorizing what you wrote and trying to figure out what the heck is this thing so that I can get back to what I was trying to do.
Oh, that's a brilliant insight that most people, in me included, don't think of. That it's not like you have to get them to open the email first. It's you have to get them to categorize it into not crap in their brain first. Oh, that's
Yeah,
brilliant.
it's the Lose Yourself by Eminem. Like we got one shot, one opportunity, right? Like we get like really wrapped up in this one message and like our team sees an average somewhere between like 35 to 40% replies on our cold messaging. And we still have to follow up like with over
Mhm.
60% of people. So like even best of the best, you still have to follow up, which means if you included everything in your first shot, right? What do you say next? Now
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're just like,
Did you see
well,
that?
was that was that not interesting? Did you not see my message? You spilled it all. And,
Yeah.
like, now you're, like, just trying to pick up the pieces and, like, figure out where you went wrong. And where you went wrong was they never actually read what you wrote.
Wow. Just gonna let that sink in.
People are very obsessed with talking about themselves in cold
Yeah.
email.
Yeah.
And the problem is, like, you're meeting somebody in a place where they are not in the mindset to absorb that information. You are introducing what I call the translation problem. And it's the same reason we don't accept resumes at Lavender. You are asking me to take this set of information about you or what you do, or, either what you do within a job aspect or what you do from a company perspective and translate it back to my problems.
Mm.
My applications at Lavender are through a cold email. It's because you have to create a narrative of explaining what you think you can help with at the company and like how your experience applies back to it and where you might fall short, right? Like that's a good cold email when you're reaching out to somebody about a job. It's the
That's a
same thing when you're reaching out.
such a cool way to drink your own champagne.
Yeah, when you think about like reaching out to somebody for a sale, right? Like we get into this like informative like nonsense of like, as you may know, buyers right now are really concerned with the state of their inbox, yada yada. Like nobody paying attention to
Yeah.
anything that you're saying. We actually see this in our data. An informative tone, like multiple informative tones, one informative tone, like literally just one. It like your reply rate goes from 0 informative tones to, oh, you included one, you lost like 1 in 4 like
Mm.
responses. 26% replied, just like drops.
Okay, so the tip there is do not try to educate in
Don't try to
your
educate. Don't try to educate them about your features, your functionalities. Like literally, your cold email at most should just say, "Yeah, we do that." You don't even need to include your company name. One of the things that people don't realize is they have a giant signature line that's acting like a massive billboard of like, here's everything that we do. And if you're interested in like the conversation around this priority that I'm trying to bring in front of you, like, oh yeah, that like kind of clarifies it.
so that rule or don't educate. Does that apply across business segments and personas? Like that's something it's like a hard and fast rule that you've seen be true.
Yes, doesn't matter. Technical buyers, non-technical buyers, marketers, it doesn't matter.
And then to follow up on that, we talked earlier about how like length of email leading to more success or less success can be cyclical. Sometimes it's going to be a shorter email that helps, sometimes a longer one. Do you think this is like that? Do you think there might come a time where an informative or educational tone becomes helpful again?
I'm not inclined to say like one way or the other.
Who
The
knows?
the data will have the answer for us, but
That's
maybe
how I know to trust everything else you said in this podcast. Someone who's willing to say, I don't know.
I mean, because like, it could totally go that way, right? Like, who knows? Maybe emails with, like, 5 rhetorical questions, like, take off. Right now, it's a terrible idea, but, like, maybe that takes off. Yeah, it could be this, like, pendulum swing of, like, people just really want more context from a seller. Maybe it's not in the cold email, but it's in follow-up to the cold
Mhm.
email where it becomes popularized. The thing that I come back to, though, is, like, the principle of, like, why you're reaching out, the thoughtfulness of like why you're reaching out. And if it's to inform, it's probably not going to generate response. So my gut tells me it won't. My gut tells me that is something that's not going to come back. And the reason for it is like the way people want to be communicated with is like on their terms. You're just like challenging human psychology by getting informative, which is if I'm informing you, I'm naturally talking at you, which does not
Yeah.
invite response. And so if I want to invite response, I need to be talking with you, which means I need to change the tone of how I display that information.
Oh, I love it. We're getting near the end here. And so to wrap up, I want to do a little one time segment I'm calling Postscript with Will Allred. Will, you said recently on LinkedIn some very brilliant things about including a PS in cold emails. Can you just tell us a little bit about that in the postscript of this podcast?
I love it. Postscript. So we did a analysis of just like a month's worth of like emails, just collected like a sample set of like 20 million, not 20 individual. Expect that people do not use a PS very often. It was present in about 5% of emails. What's interesting about that 5% is if you included a PS in an automated template, so like an automated step in, say, outreach, it literally did not change your reply rate. No one cares. Um,
Interesting.
but if you personalized and there was a PS present, you saw 35% more replies. So
Wow.
it has a huge impact when you're personalizing an email. And I think of this in a couple ways. One, you should totally apply this to your social messaging. I'll explain that in a second. But two, like if you're doing your research, right? I'm talking about like, I'm researching you, Colin, and I'm like looking into the podcast is really like the core reason why I'm reaching out. But like there's something unique about like your experience going from like agency into, sales hacker. And like I want to bring that up. Do that in the PS. Right? It's not
Mhm.
relevant to why you're reaching out, but it's a great like place to add it. Or maybe like there's a sales hacker event coming up I say like, hey, PS, like I saw you're hosting this event on XYZ. Have you thought about ZYX? Right? It's just like these clever like ways to make it feel warmer, more inviting. I think a big reason why it's working so well, 35%, is it stands out.
I was going to say that the reason it's working well is maybe because only 5%
5% of people do.
are including
Yeah.
it.
And so it immediately feels more personal. But if they immediately sniff out that it's not personal, then it immediately loses its effect. Right. The reason I'm so bullish on it for social messaging is because of the way the LinkedIn inbox works. So I get the notification on my phone and I see the top of the message, just like the email, right? I pull it up and I look at it on a desktop. I see the bottom of the message first. And so all of a sudden, I've lost all of that personalization and it becomes top of fold. So LinkedIn's actually done some analysis on, they refer to any DM in LinkedIn as, which
Uh-huh.
I don't know why. They don't
Yeah,
just
it's
say
not the same.
IMs, like try to bring it back a little old school, but well, I'll call it IMs. IMs on a desktop, you see the bottom of it first. They've done some research on this, and a personalized IM gets 35% more replies. That's a far cry from the 2x on email when you personalize. And so, what's going on? It's the reader's experience, right? It goes back to how the buyer's experiencing your outbound. They're only seeing the bottom portion, right? And so, if you're doing your outbound, you're including links on LinkedIn, you better believe that's just that preview text, just like gone, because
Yeah.
all they're going to see is a link and they're just going to assume it's spam. The way to do that is send your link first and then send the message immediately afterwards so that they see the message and like point them back up.
Could you
The
hedge your bets on whether they're going to open it on mobile where they see the top first or on desktop where they see the bottom first and
That's what
create like a
nostalgia,
personalization
right?
sandwich?
Personalization sandwich.
Personalization, message personalization.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be like a net new observation, right? Like it doesn't have to be like PS, but you can
Mhm.
allude to the fact that you personalize at the top versus like making some hyper aggressive ask at the bottom where all they'll see is that aggressive ask and like they're just gonna be like, nah.
Wow, that's a searing insight. And as usual from you, backed by actual data and informed opinions, not just, shiny objects. Will, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is your first time on the Sales Hacker podcast, right? With either me or Sam?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
You gotta
Well,
make it
we'll
a
have to do it
I gotta
again
make it a
sometime.
recurring thing, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been great having you, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks for checking out Sales Hacker. If you enjoyed what you learned, subscribe to the show wherever you get your favorite podcasts, or visit saleshacker.com to get access to all of the latest episodes.